Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this week's Monday Zen and Zazen class. Today I want to start a new bi-weekly series on the Heart Sutra. But before I start to talk about the Heart Sutra, as always, let's sit together for 30 minutes.
我们今天开始就会讲心经了，好像是每周，老师刚才说是 weekly，每周都会讲，有点高兴啊，不是上回隔周了哈，每周都会讲。然后我们前面还是先坐禅30分钟啊。
Thank you for joining. So now I would like to start the Heart Sutra series. Let me share the screen. There's some chat. Okay. Let me share the screen. Probably now on the right side you can see a text of the Heart Sutra. The original classical Chinese version, and below that's a contemporary Japanese text. I made that translation a couple of years ago. And below that you have an English translation by Thich Nhat Hanh. And you can find that also on the internet. There's the address. And this text, probably won't get there today, but if you would like to have a look at it, I will share a link where you can download it in the chat function. So if you want to read it or if you want to download it until in 2 weeks, you can do that. Before I want to actually study the text, I want to talk about the origin of the Heart Sutra. On the left side, you see there's this thesis that the Heart Sutra actually is a Chinese apocryphal text. Most of the sutras that we know today, including the Heart Sutras, usually we think that they come from India. And also in the case of the Heart Sutra, there's a Sanskrit text. So it's most natural to suppose that somebody brought this Sanskrit text to China and it was translated in China. Usually it's said that it was translated in China by a very famous Chinese monk by the name, in Japanese you pronounce it Genjo, but in Chinese probably it's Xuan. He translated, or he brought most, if not all of the sutras from India to China, and he also wrote a very famous travel journal about his travels. I think the Western Journey, it's called in English. And he's usually credited with having translated the Heart Sutra. He lived in the 7th century, so after Bodhidharma, but long before Dogen visited China. And there's another famous Chinese translator of the sutras. His name is Kumarajiva, or in Japanese Kumaraju. And he lived in the 4th century. And he didn't translate all of the sutras, but the translation that he made are usually credited as being especially, beautiful, or here in the Wikipedia it says they are unparalleled, either in terms of translation technique or degree of fidelity. On the other hand, in the case of this Xuanzang article, it says in this section here, his version of the Heart Sutra, and basically that's the one that we have today. There's another version that exists in Tibetan Buddhism. I will maybe talk about that later. So there's a Tibetan version, and then there's the Chinese version that's also used in Japan. And that's the version that's translated by him. His version of the Heart Sutra is the basis for all Chinese commentaries on the sutra and recitations throughout China, Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. His style was, by Chinese standards, cumbersome and overly literal. So to put it in a more positive way, Xuanzang was very precise, and he kept really to the letter of the Sanskrit. He was very faithful, while Kumaraju's translations are much more beautiful and easier to read. Maybe if you have read the old Pali scriptures, you know that they can be sometimes very tiring and repetitive, especially if the English translation is literal to the Sanskrit. For some reason, either the Buddha himself or his students, they made a point of repeating things over and over again. And Kumaraju or Kumarajiva was very good at abridging these parts. Makes them easier to read. And compared to Kumarajiva, Xuanzang was more, well, overly literal, they say here, and marked by scholarly innovations in terminology, usually where another version by the earlier translator Kumarajiva exists, Kumarajiva is more popular. But in the case of the Heart Sutra, there's no Kumarajiva translation. But now what I wanted to talk about today is that actually there are scholars that say that Xuanzang didn't translate the Heart Sutra, or at least that's how I translate it. I understand it. If you look for that academic paper, you can either, well, if you are interested, you can download it from this link I can show you here. It's this paper here. That's what I downloaded today. It's by, I think originally she's from the Netherlands, a lady scholar by the name Jeanne Nattier, who wrote this article in the early 90s, I think. And I'm not quite sure how I heard about this article, but a couple of years ago I had an exchange with a person. His name is Edward Jayarava Edward. He also writes about the Chinese origins of the Heart Sutra, and I don't know this paper here, but even this year in 2024, he wrote a new article, Heart to Heart, a comparative study of and commentary on the Chinese and Sanskrit Heart Sutra texts. And basically what he writes here, in 1992, Jeanne Nattier, that Dutch lady, published the Watershed article in which she made a very strong argument that the Heart Sutra was compiled or composed in China and not in India. As I've discussed, the reaction in Japan was one of horror, denial, and rejection. Actually, most Japanese don't even know about this. So it's not only is it not accepted, most Japanese have never heard about that there's a theory that the Heart Sutra did not come from India, but was composed or compiled in China. And basically the theory that is put forth is that there was a Sanskrit text of this sutra here. I don't want to talk too long before Xuanzang translate, but maybe I have to say this. The Heart Sutra, usually it's called the Makahanya Haramita Shingyo. The heart of Makahanya, great wisdom. The heart of the great wisdom. The Heart Sutra of great wisdom. And in India, there were the Wisdom Sutras. There are 600 volumes. And these were all translated both by Kumarajiva and by Xuanzang. Both translated all 600 volumes. But the earlier translator, Kumarajiva, didn't translate the Heart Sutra for whatever reason. The Heart Sutra is sometimes said to be the essence of all 600 volumes. And actually, as this scholar points out, Heart Sutra, the core part of it, is a literal quote from one of these texts, which is this one here. Maybe you read it, Pancha Vim Sata Safarika Prajna Paramita Sutra. So basically there's a Sanskrit text that was translated into Chinese by both Kumarajiva and Xuan. And a part of that became the Heart Sutra, and then this new theory is that was translated back into Sanskrit. And probably all of this talk wouldn't make much sense if I also maybe show you the Heart Sutra text and the translations that exist. This here is, those of you who can read Chinese will recognize it's the core part of the Hanya Shingyo. Shali Hotsu, Shali Shi, it probably says here. For some reason, because of Zoom, I can't read the top part of it. But it should be Shali Shi, Shiki Fui, Kuku Fui, Shiki, Shiki Sokuze, Kuku, Sokuze, Shiki, and so forth. So that's the maybe most famous part. It says Shariputra, form is not different from emptiness. Emptiness is not different from form. Form is exactly emptiness. Emptiness is exactly form, and so forth. Jusogyo Shiki Yakubunyo Ze. And this is something that you can also find on the internet. So this number here allows you to look it up on the internet. There are these two addresses here. I will share this also in the chat function if you're interested. This is basically the whole canon of Buddhist scriptures that you can look up on the internet. There's two different versions here. This one, probably Tokyo University here, and this looks like some university in Kyoto. Maybe it's Kyoto University. And this one is wiki source. I think that's only the Hanya Shingyo text. If you look that up on the internet, this one is the Kyoto University version, and this one is the Tokyo University version. If you click on this here, if you click on here, you go here and you can, for example, you can search. You can search for, if you want, for example, form is emptiness, these 4 characters. You can put in here and it will give you all the sutras, all the texts where this phrase appears in. And that's basically how I found these texts. Let me go back to the texts. So that's the Hanya Shingyo, and you can find it under this address in the Buddhist canon. And now let's have a look at this text here in the middle. It also starts with Shali Shi, which means Shariputra. Shiki Fui Kuku Fui Shiki Shiki Sokuze Kuku Sokuze Shiki. Until here it's the same as the Hanya Shingyo. But then it's a little bit different. Jusogyo Shiki Fui Ku. Ku Fui Jusogyo Shiki. Jusogyo Shiki Sokuze Ku. Ku Sokuze Jusogyo Shiki. In the Hanya Shingyo, what you have is only this Jusogyo Shiki Yakubunyo Se. That means form is emptiness, emptiness form, and it's the same for perception, for our thoughts, for our reaction to the thoughts, and it's the same for consciousness as a whole. So basically, the translator says what was said about form, The same is true for the other 4 skandhas. In Buddhism, we talk about 5 skandhas. I will explain those in a couple of weeks. Basically, what we say about form is also true about the other 4 skandhas. While this translator here, he's more literal. He says, perception is not different from emptiness. Emptiness is not different from perception. Perception is the same as emptiness, and emptiness is the same as perception. And why is that? Well, this is actually a translation by Xuan of one of the wisdom sutras where this quote is from. So Xuan is more, well, cumbersome, some say. He's very literal, precise. And how did Kumaraju translate this portion? Kumarajiva. You find it here. Kumarajiva, he translates the name of Shariputra in a different way. He doesn't say Shali Shi, he says Shali Hotsu. Shali Hotsu. So there's a difference here. But apart from that, it's exactly the Hanya Shingyo text. And later there's this one line here that you don't find in the Hanya Shingyo, which means there's no past, there's no present, there's no future. That's something that you don't find in the Hanya Shingyo. But apart from that, it's precisely the text of the Hanya Shingyo. While Xuan, it's quite different. If you look also at the later part, he's using much more characters. Even looking at the text, you will see he's using much more words. So looking at this alone, it's quite obvious that this text of the Hanya Shingyo, that's not Xuanzang's style. It's much closer to Kumarajiva's style. Actually, it's exactly Kumarajiva's style, except for the name Shali Shi in the beginning. And also the Hanya Shingyo, as you probably know, it starts with Kanji Zai Bosatsu. Kanji Zai Bosatsu is the bodhisattva that you see behind me. It's Avalokiteshvara. And Kumarajiva, he translates the same name, Avalokiteshvara, as Kanzeon Bosatsu. So the names are different. But the text in itself, the style of the text, that's not Xuanzang's text. So the theory, as I understand it, is that in the 8th century or so, at the time, they had the 600-volume Wisdom Sutra. And unlike today, you didn't have an internet. You didn't have a library. So if you wanted to read these texts, you have to find some library where they are and you have to copy them for themselves. And nobody had the time to do that. And if monks were traveling, they couldn't carry these scriptures around. So at that time, around the 8th century, people had somehow maybe agreed that this part, the Heart Sutra, is kind of the most important part, the central part. And also, Avalokiteshvara at that time had become a very popular bodhisattva, so they added the part of Avalokiteshvara in the beginning. Normally, a sutra would start with, "Thus have I heard," and then the Buddha would appear. But for some reason, the Heart Sutra skips over that. The Heart Sutra starts with Avalokiteshvara, and then this central part comes. And then in the end, you have the Dharani, Gyate, Gyate, Hala, so Gyate. The monks at the time of Xuanzang had somehow created their own portable Wisdom Sutra, the Heart Sutra. But of course, you can't create a sutra out of nothing. Sutras need to be translated from the Sanskrit. So what people did is, Xuanzang was famous for bringing the sutras to China, and he probably had just started translating. So what people did is they used the Kumarajiva translation, but then they faked the names so that it looked as if it was a new translation by Xuan. They credited to Xuan, although it was obviously not his style. And thus they gave authority to the sutra. And to give it even more authority, they then translated it back to Sanskrit. And I don't know any Sanskrit, but if you read through these academic papers, the Sanskrit scholars say that the Sanskrit version of the Heart Sutra sounds very different from the other Sanskrit texts of the other wisdom sutras. So it's very unlikely that these two texts end up sounding almost the same. And funnily, kind of, when Kumarajiva translated one Sanskrit text, and then Xuanzan, his rival, translated the other Sanskrit text, they seem to be almost the same. How can you explain it? Well, you can't explain it, except that actually some Chinese monks composed the Heart Sutra, and then it was translated back into Sanskrit. Sorry for talking so much for today. I wanted to introduce you with this theory that the Heart Sutra is actually not an Indian text, but an apocryphal Chinese text. And the actual text we will start to read in 2 weeks. But before we start with questions, if you have any, please, Xuan-san, if you like. Maybe you can give translation or short digest.
今天老师其实做了一个简介，他没有讲具体内容。然后老师刚刚我就是因为太长了哈，我给大家简单的说一下。就是老师说那个其实这个翻译其实是有争议的，就是心经呢，它是从中文，就是是玄奘，就是有一种说法是说是玄奘把这个经文带到了中国之后，然后由玄奘法师翻译的。但是其实还有另外一个版本，就是鸠摩罗什翻译的版本。然后他们两个人翻译的版本不大一样。玄奘法师翻译的版本字数比较多，然后比较流行，就是广为流传。现在大部分人好像知道的，就是说《心经》是玄奘法师翻译的。然后其实，在那之前呢，还有一种说法是鸠摩罗什他翻译的，但是他翻译的之后，他翻译那个版本呢，断句非常漂亮，字句非常工整，很易读。就是在网上，其实大家可以找一找，刚刚老师也给大家看了，就是有2个不同的版本，一个是字数比较多，一个字数比较少。然后其实还有第3个版本，就是在西藏还有一个心经的版本。现在基本上是这3个版本，但是其实也是有争议的，就是国际上可能也有不同的学者，就是说这个我们现在这个心经有可能是先有了中文，然后又翻译回梵语的，也有这种说法，就是说就是然后这个是有不同的，不是一个学者啊，是有不同的学者都提出了这样的文章，就是说这个心经我们现在读的这个心经，然后翻译回去之后，之前那个梵语呢，其实不是原来的原来的梵文版本，应该是玄奘法师翻译完中文之后又翻译回去的，就是不是他原来从印度带回来的那个梵语版本了。应该现在大家可能读到的那个是玄奘法师带到中国之后，因为是他翻译成中文，然后又被别人翻译回去的那个梵语，可能现在读到的不是原来的那个梵语版本了。然后然后老师还提到了，那个有很多，就是你看刚刚老师提到2个不同的那个就是词嘛，就是最有名的就是那个舍利子那一段嘛，大家都知道舍利子那一段。然后就是什么空不异色，色不异空那段是比较流行的一段。然后现在日本比较流行的那个版本呢，应该是京都大学翻译的一个版本，就是也是从中文翻译成日语的。然后最流行的也是在日本也是流行的是这一段。然后这个就是那个鸠摩罗什 应该是法师哈，他在翻译中间有一些部分其实是和玄奘法师是不一样的。比如说，他提到了有关过去、将来还有未来的一些内容，但是其实玄奘法师他这儿其实是不一样的，不管是从字数上还是从翻译的大概其的工整啊，内容上面其实是有一些差别的。在那个是在很早以前，那个时候没有网络的时候是有图书馆，然后大家可能想要读这个文章的时候，可能搜不到，一定要去图书馆看。然后有一些和尚他可能就是在翻译这个玄奘法师翻译成梵语的时候，可能会加了一些他自己的一些就是内容吧。然后，但是为了给他翻译回去的这个梵语翻译回去的这个梵语的心经有一个缘由，所以他说这是玄奘法师翻译的。但其实有一种可能说可能是不是的，可能不知道是哪个什么和尚又翻译成回去的。因为你看这个原文，就是鸠摩罗什法师和玄奘法师那个中文其实翻译过来是不一样的，但是他翻译回去的梵语呢，好像都是一样的。就说明可能这个中间可能会有可能是个谁他翻译回去的，然后把两个都翻译成一样了，然后就是说这个地方是有争议的，但是具体是谁现在不知道。嗯，还有就是这个所以两个版本就是刚刚老师就是重点讲的是这个两个版本，然后大家有问题的话可以跟老师提，这个可能还是要隔周读，然后从下一节课开始老师可能会逐句翻译。大家要是有想交流的，可以跟老师提问啊。
Thank you. That was a very short digest, I guess, but it's already 9 o'clock. If you have questions, sorry, it was a little bit academic today, but if you have questions about this part, Origins of the Heart Sutra, you're welcome to ask or share whatever you would like to ask or share. Joseph is raising his hand, please.
Yeah, as a PhD student, no need to apologize for it being too academic. But I guess my question is, like you said, this debate, what we talked about today, is kind of an academic debate.
Yes.
But what does it mean for you as a Zen monk, and what does it mean for us as practitioners of Zazen? Because our concern is perhaps different from academics who want to, have a debate about where exactly was the text composed. We also are interested in what the text means for our lives now.
Well, it seems that a lot of scholars in Japan were kind of taken aback or are opposed to this theory because it takes away the authority of the Heart Sutra. But in the case of Zen, what we chant in Zen, for example, there's the so-called Hokyo Zammai. I forgot now the English name. It's the jewel mirror samadhi. Something like Baochang Sammei, maybe. And there's the Sandokai. These are all the Shinshin Mei, Shinshin Ming. These are all Chinese texts which we chant in Zen as sutras. So from the Zen perspective, it doesn't really matter if it's from China or if it's from India. The question is, what do I do with that text? Also, Bodhidharma is credited with, we don't base our practice on the scriptures. We still recite the scriptures. We try to take some direction or hints from the scriptures. So from a Zen perspective, it doesn't really matter so much if the Sanskrit version came first and then it was translated into Chinese as everybody believed until 50 years ago, or if Zhan Natye is right and it was the other way around. It's just that I think it's an interesting theory, and what I think is interesting that until 30 years ago nobody seemed to have realized. If even somebody like myself taking a look at the text, it's obvious. It's so obvious that that's not Xuanzang's style, that's Kumarajiva's style. How come that nobody noticed? And maybe it's an example of something that I think it was Feininger who talked about cargo science, I think. He took that name from, I don't know, in the 50s or 60s, the US, they were kind of using some Southern Pacific islands to land their planes there, and they were kind of dumping all these canned meat stuff and kind of, how do you say, giving it to the people living there. These people were really happy. Out of nothing, these planes came with all the canned meat. And after a decade or so, the Americans didn't use these islands anymore. Nobody came there anymore. But the people that lived on the islands, obviously, they were still hoping for planes to come. So they were still waving flags on the airports that the Americans had built in the hope that whenever planes came, somebody had waved a flag. So they thought, well, if we wave a flag here, planes will come. And so that's what Feininger says is cargo science. And he uses this term then for when people realized that the findings, somehow some measurements of some scientist that was supposed to be an authority, nobody doubted that what he said was right, but people were making measurements and it didn't match the theory. Feininger had kind of found out that over the years, people knew, how do you say, the right number, but they were kind of fixing the experiment so that it was closer to what would be accord with the theory. Everybody thought this theory must be right. So they were kind of fumbling around. And I have the impression that probably people must have known that the Heart Sutra, that doesn't look like Xuanzang, but nobody wanted to say it. People were afraid to say it. And when Jean Nardier 30 years ago, kind of like with the story of the naked emperor, but he has no clothes. Still, even though she says that, nobody believes her. That's what I find interesting about the story. That even now in Japan, nobody would really believe that Xuanzang did not translate the Heart Sutra. While looking at the texts that I showed you today, I find it hard to believe any other way. How could that be possible, that Xuanzang translates the Heart Sutra and then this other text that he also translates looks so completely different? So that's what I find. It has nothing to do with the Dharma, and really it doesn't affect our practice, but it shows us a little bit about, well, how the human mind works and how even the mind of an academic works. You trust more the authority of tradition than your own logical thinking a lot of the time. And Feininger, when he talks about this, he talks about physics. Even in physics, it's like that. So that's why I used so much time today to talk about it. But if you ask me, well, does this really matter for my daily practice? The answer is no. It doesn't really affect your daily practice, I think.
It's a very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Chris, please.
I had a question, and then I have another brief question to follow up on Joseph's question. So I was just thinking off of that last question. So theoretically, it wouldn't matter if we lost all the text. It should be possible for someone else to find this meaning in life on their own. And I think that makes sense. And I think Dogen alludes to that when he says that there are like natural Buddhas. But then on the other hand, it's important to find a teacher that's emphasized in Zen practice. So then how would you explain that? Would you just say, like, it's easier, it's much more effective to find the right way with a teacher, but it still would be possible for someone practicing on their own to find the same way?
Yeah, I mean, the Buddha found it by himself. So if you think, well, if it worked for the Buddha, I can do it without scriptures, without a teacher. Well, it's worth a try. But I think most of us, we feel having a teacher is much safer, it's quicker. And then there's this discussion, well, aren't the scriptures just as important as the teacher, or maybe even more important, because the scriptures, they date back 2,500 years ago. So should we not first rely on the scriptures and maybe also have a teacher? And in Zen we say it's the other way around. You should have a teacher and maybe also the scriptures. Maybe a good metaphor in this case would be yoga. I mean, can you learn yoga by yourself, invent it out of nothing? In theory, yes, of course you can if you're a genius person, but it's much easier if you learn it from the tradition. Can you learn yoga from books? Yes, probably. Or from the internet? Yes, but if you have a teacher, much better than a whole library of books on yoga. And it's the same with Zen. Of course, having the Shobogenzo and having the Mumonkan and all these texts is helpful. But having a teacher that you can meet as often as possible, and not only to talk with him and discuss with her questions, but share the life. Like, for example, in Antaji, in a setting like Antaji, you can share the whole day with that person. That's a lot of help. Of course, you can do without, but that helps a lot. It's like, well, climbing a mountain with a guide. And if you don't have a guide, if you have a map, also help. And maybe, in theory, you can climb. Somebody must have climbed the Mount Everest for the first time without a guide and without a map. But it's much easier. It's much easier if you have a guide that comes with you. And that's basically the role of the teacher in Zen.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense to me. And then just another, my initial question was, the person, this theory, they're saying that the Heart Sutra was maybe rewritten in China and not original from India. But the people that have that theory, they're not doubting the other perfection of wisdom sutras that supposedly. So the history is Xuanzang went to this place called Nalanda, which was a famous monastery where the history says that the founder of Yogacara, Vasubandhu, and then he taught like the famous philosopher Dignaga, and then there was two other guys, and then Xuanzang went there, and then he supposedly brought back all of these perfection of wisdom sutras from there.
Yes.
So, but they're not doubting that. They're just saying that the Heart Sutra was okay, I got it.
Yeah. So both Kumarajiva and Xuanzang brought the 600 volumes of the Wisdom Sutra. They both translated it from the Sanskrit. It's just hard to believe that the translation that we have of the Heart Sutra stems from Xuanzang. And also it couldn't be from Kumarajiva then, because then he would have translated the names of Kanjizai Bosatsu and Shali Shi as Kanzeon Bosatsu and Shali Hotsu. So we don't know exactly who did what, but my understanding is that somebody took that central part from Kumarajiva's version, changed the names, and they added that section with Avalokiteshvara. Probably that Bodhisattva was very important to them, and they also added the end with this Dharani. So Dharani mantras, that's something that in the early Buddhism was not so important, but then in the 8th century, this esoteric Buddhism, that stream became more important, so they added it. So all of the elements, of course, already existed in Indian Buddhism. It's just that they put it together, added it in China in this form, and credit it to Xuan because he had a great authority. If it was credited to Xuan, then nobody would doubt that that's an authentic sutra. That's at least the idea that I get. Eugene is raising his hand. Please.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you, as a person who actually was doing the translations of to you, Savaki Roshi, so how would you say when the Buddhist text or any other religion's text maybe is being translated to another language and then yet to another language, does it actually, and how much the original sense does it actually lose during that translation, especially if those are languages different as the Chinese and as Japanese and English, Japanese and German, for example? Does it, when you do the translation, is it inevitable that the original text meaning is being distorted due to difference of these languages and different of paradigms that people in those two languages are actually think? I'm asking you as a person who actually did the translations, and what is your opinion on this?
Well, the short answer is I don't think that it's necessarily distorted. Of course, that can happen. There's this game that maybe all over the world little children play it, like you whisper something into your friend's ear and they whisper it into the next person's ear. And then if it makes a whole round, everybody's laughing because a completely different sentence became out of that first sentence. And of course that can happen, that things are lost in translation. But it's not necessarily so, and I think ideally, for example, Sanskrit and Chinese are completely different languages, and Chinese and German or English are completely different languages. So if you hand it down in the same language over the centuries, people repeat it over and over, but you stop thinking about the meaning. In theory, nothing should be lost because the language stays the same. But people, well, they presume they understand the words because it's their language, but you don't think about the meaning anymore. Each time you have to translate it, you have to understand the text, and otherwise you can't translate it. You really have to get deep into it. So actually, when a text is translated, it's a great chance, because often that happened to me, I thought I understood the text, but then when I go and translate it, I realize how I don't understand it. So I have to really go to the core. And so I think it was also a great chance when these sutras were translated to Chinese, when they came to Japan, and now they come to the West. Of course, if we don't care, something gets lost. But actually, it often happens that when people translate it, they discover things that were lost for centuries because nobody really thought about the text. They chanted the text. They repeated the text over and over. Maybe it's even the same in the Christian church. We say these prayers, but we never really think about what we are praying there. But if you have to translate such a prayer into a different language, then you think, what have I recited all the time? So that's why I say it doesn't have to be necessarily a distortion. Actually, often a translation means that you really have to go to the ground of the matter once more.
It means like that you have not to translate automatically like Google Translator, but first, before making one word into another, you have to go first to the sense of this word, to whatever lies underneath, and then from underneath to bring this word to another language.
Exactly.
Thank you.
I mean, that's maybe also why at least the Wikipedia article on Kumarajiva and Xuanzang, that they praised Kumarajiva so much, because his translation is not as literal as Xuanzang's, but in a way, often you get the feeling, well, he gets the core more than Xuanzang, who's more literal, but, well, Wikipedia calls him cumbersome. Any other questions? Anything else you would like to ask or share? If not, next time I get back to you, but then in 2 weeks, let's start with the actual text of the Hanya Shingyo, Avalokiteshvara. So I will talk about the actual, well, matter of the thing. Thank you for joining. I'm sorry that it was so academic today, but I don't plan to continue in this vein. So also thank you, Xuan-san, for hosting us. Sorry that you didn't have the time to translate as thoroughly as always, but next time I will, how do you say, make it more short, my part a little bit more short. Thank you for joining. Have a nice week. If you like, see you again next week.